Never thought I'd see the day.
До свидания, мой сын.
Welcome to Variant. After the events of John Wick 4, many were left wondering if John had actually died or if he had cheated death once again. Good news for fans, he is back, and now I will bring you a story about the expert in kicking here so you can get up to speed on our universe of movie stories. Without further ado, let's get straight to the point. John Wick's last breath. Dusk was falling gently over an isolated cabin in the Italian mountains. The orange light of the sun was shining through the windows, illuminating the aged figure of a man sitting in a worn leather armchair. The gentle breeze was rustling the leaves of the nearby forest, bringing a silence that seemed to be John Wick's only company in recent years. He had withdrawn from the world, leaving behind the violence, chaos, and blood that had consumed his life for so long. To the world, John Wick was dead. His legend, immortalized in the criminal underworld, had become a myth. But the man before the fire, with scars that crisscrossed his body like maps of past battles, knew that peace would never truly be his. John was older, his beard now gray, his movements a little slower, but the cunning in his eyes remained alive. The physical pain did not bother him as much as the emptiness that had inhabited his soul since the death of his wife Helen. He had faced the high table, defeated the greatest of all assassins, and yet darkness followed him. The crackling of the flames was interrupted by a familiar sound, a slow knock on the front door of the cabin. John did not move immediately. Calmly, his calloused fingers reached for the pistol under the arm of the chair. After all these years, the survival instinct was still intact. He knew that whoever was on the other side knew exactly who they were dealing with. The door opened slowly, and a hooded figure entered. The wind seemed to stop at that moment. The atmosphere changed, as if the air itself recognized the presence of that being. The figure entered without hesitation, advancing to the center of the room until it stopped in front of John. The hooded head tilted slightly, and a low, ancient voice whispered, "The mission is not over yet." John looked up, not surprised, but with an exhaustion that came from his soul. "I knew it," he murmured, his voice deep as the distant thunder of a storm. "It never ends." The figure removed the hood, revealing a pale, ageless face. It was Baba Yaga, the personification of all the legends of the underworld. John had heard whispers of her when he was still young, an entity feared by all criminals, but he never imagined that she would come to him. It was as if fate itself was at stake. The high table may have fallen, but the serpents are not dead, Baba Yaga continued, her voice piercing John's mind like a cold blade. "There is more, and they will return." John sighed, rising from the chair with some difficulty. His body ached, but his mind was sharp. "I am ready," he said firmly, without hesitation. The new order. After his fake death, John had sought refuge, not because he feared the return of his enemies, but because he knew he needed time to heal, both physically and emotionally. Over the years, he had heard rumors that the high table was fragmented, but new powers were emerging. Criminal factions that once lurked in the shadows were now preparing to claim their place. John looked at Baba Yaga, his eyes meeting hers. There was something about her that made him understand that this battle would be different from all the others. It was not just a matter of revenge or survival. Something bigger was at stake, something that involved the entire underworld he had tried to leave behind. "Who are they?" John asked, reaching for his leather coat, feeling the weight of the pistol strapped to its holster. "The ones who betrayed you. The ones who never accepted your retirement," Baba Yaga said. "What happened to the high table was just the beginning. There are secrets that even you don't know, John Wick. Secrets that threaten to destroy everything." John knew she was right. For years, he had been a pawn in a much larger game, unaware of the forces that drove the underworld. Old enemies, new faces. As John braced himself, memories began to flood his mind. Faces from the past, old enemies he thought were dead, began to resurface. The Baba Yaga had told him of a secret council, an organization that operated even above the high table. They were the true masterminds of global violence, manipulating every faction, every territory. And now, with the power vacuum left by the fall of the high table, they were ready to emerge. At the center of it all was a name John would never forget, Silas Vanderhoff. Vanderhoff was one of the few who had escaped John's attention in the past, a man who controlled the finances and information of all the criminal clans. He had hidden in the shadows while John toppled the high table, waiting for the right moment to regain control. As Wick investigated, he realized that Vanderhoff's network was even more intricate than he had imagined. Sleeper cells in various parts of the world were waiting for the command to act. All of this converged towards a greater goal: to restore criminal order with Vanderhoff at the top. The return to arms. The first confrontation took place in Prague. John, accompanied by Kane, a former ally, was forced to face an ambush organized by an elite mercenary faction. They knew of his survival, and news spread quickly. Wick had no choice but to return to his old style of combat, efficient and lethal. The enemies fell one by one, but John could see that these soldiers were not just hired thugs. They were well-equipped, well-informed, and most of all, they were ready to die for the cause. Kane, at his side, asked, "Are you sure you want to continue with this?" He thought he was free from this life. John, catching his breath after a brutal shootout, replied, "I was never free. There is always something lurking, waiting to pull me back." The revelations the search for Vanderhoff took him to places forgotten by time. Encounters with former allies, such as Sophia and Winston, provided John with the information he needed. Sophia, now living under a new identity, was hesitant to help, but the debt she owed to John was greater than her fear. "If Vanderhoff is really behind this, you know he's not alone," Sophia said, as she arranged the weapons in her hiding place. "I know, but I'm going to put an end to this once and for all," John replied, as coolly as ever. At the same time, Winston, back at the rebuilt Continental, revealed a key piece of the puzzle. Vanderhoff had access to the High Table's most secret files, including information about a project called Ex Machina. This project, led by underworld scientists, aimed to create a new generation of enhanced assassins, both mentally and physically. The final encounter, the journey, took John back to New York, the place where it all began. New York, the city where it all began, and perhaps where it all would end. The Continental had risen again, although it still bore the scars of the events that had destroyed it. It was symbolic that John was back in that setting. The air of the city seemed heavier now. Every shadow in the alleys and every face on the horizon seemed to hide him, ready to attack or watch. Here, the hunt for Vanderhoff would culminate. John knew the enemy was close. Kane and Sophia had returned to their own battles. The war against Vanderhoff was too big to be won by one person, but John Wick had never been just an ordinary person. He had a clear goal: to eliminate Vanderhoff and finally put an end to this web of chaos that threatened to rebuild the High Table's order. Winston was waiting for him at the entrance to the Continental, now run by a different manager, but with Winston still operating behind the scenes. His old ally looked at Wick with a mixture of sadness and respect. "Vanderhoff is in a safe house in Brooklyn," Winston said, his voice echoing off the hotel's luxurious walls. "He knows you're coming, John. He's prepared." John nodded. He knew it would be difficult. He knew Vanderhoff was different from the enemies he had faced before. But after everything he had been through, what could be different? With each battle, Wick felt the weight of the years, the violence, the loss, but somehow that made him more dangerous. He walked through the doors of the Continental into the unknown, a gun on his hip and the conviction that he would only return victorious or not at all. The Brooklyn Maze. Silas Vanderhoff's hideout was an old mansion, forgotten by time, in an industrial area of Brooklyn. A discreet place, but fortified with layers of security and mercenaries ready to die for their master. It was the perfect lair for the architect of a new order. John didn't approach with subtlety. He never needed to. From the moment he set foot on the street, the message was clear. Wick was here, and he was coming to hunt. The first guards appeared like shadows around the corners. 3 well-armed men fired at John without warning. But, as always, he was ready. In a flawless sequence, Wick took down the 3 with precise shots, moving with the efficiency that had made him a legend. The entrance to the mansion was a veritable fortress. There were sensors, landmines, and guards at every strategic point. John observed, calculated every step, every movement. That was what he did best, adapting amidst chaos. Entering the place was like descending into the circles of hell itself. Each floor of the mansion seemed designed to confuse, disorient, and, ultimately, destroy any intruder. John faced battles in every corridor, in fierce hand-to-hand combat and quick, relentless exchanges of gunfire. The sound of gunshots echoed off the walls, but Wick, always focused, advanced, moving like a specter of death. His objective was clear: get to Silas Vanderhoff. The confrontation with Vanderhoff. Finally, after hours of fighting, John Wick found himself in the mansion's main hall. The space was large, almost empty, except for Silas Vanderhoff, sitting in a leather armchair in the center, surrounded by computers and screens that flashed with information about the criminal world. Vanderhoff was a thin, calm-looking man, but his eyes shone with the same malice and intelligence that made him the leader behind the fall of the High Table. "John Wick," Vanderhoff said, a thin smile on his lips. "I thought the world had buried you. You are persistent, I must admit." John didn't answer. He wasn't there for conversation. The silence between the two turned into a palpable tension. Wick knew Vanderhoff had something prepared. He would never leave his fate in the hands of a simple confrontation. "Do you think destroying the High Table brought peace, John?" Vanderhoff continued, slowly standing up. "The criminal world is like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two new ones grow. You can't run away from human nature." John stepped forward, his gun still firmly in his hand, without hesitation. "I'm not running away," Wick said in his deep voice. "I'm finishing this." Vanderhoff laughed, a low, contemptuous laugh, before pressing a hidden button on his desk. The floor around John collapsed, revealing a network of tunnels beneath the mansion. It was a trap. John fell, rolling downward, but quickly got back up, already on guard. The underground tunnel was full of mercenaries, ready to eliminate him. Vanderhoff knew that to finish John Wick, it would take more than weapons. It would take isolating him, weakening him mentally and physically. The return of Baba Yaga. But deep in the tunnel, something unexpected happened. Just when it seemed Wick was cornered, a shadowy figure emerged from the shadows. It was Baba Yaga. His eyes were like embers, and his presence filled the air with an oppressive chill. "You're not done yet, John Wick," his voice echoed off the stone walls. "There's more at stake than revenge. Those who follow Vanderhoff are worse than you can imagine." John didn't respond, but his body was ready, his instincts sharper than ever. With Baba Yaga's help, he began to turn the tide. Mercenaries fell one by one as John, guided by an almost supernatural force, advanced through the underground labyrinth. It was as if the darkness itself was on his side. The end of the game. Finally, after making his way through the labyrinth, John emerged back to the surface. Vanderhoff was waiting for him on a helipad atop the mansion, ready to make his escape. The tension in the air was palpable. With Baba Yaga gone, the final showdown between Wick and Vanderhoff was inevitable. The sound of the helicopter blades spinning was drowned out by John's slow, measured footsteps as he approached. Vanderhoff drew his gun, but there was no time for a final word. In a split second, John fired. Vanderhoff's body fell ingloriously. John stood still for a long moment, staring at the New York skyline in the distance. The war seemed to be over, but he knew that true peace would never be his. The last exile days had passed since the final confrontation. John Wick had disappeared again, this time without a trace. Some say he had secluded himself in the mountains, others that he had assumed a new identity in a remote location. But one thing was certain, the criminal world would never be the same after John Wick. Now, with the High Table shattered and Vanderhoff dead, the underworld seemed to breathe an air of uncertainty. But for those who still whispered the name John Wick, they knew that somewhere he was waiting, always ready, always alert. Because in the end, the mission never ends. So, what did you think of this story? If you've come this far, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.